Good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of the Breakthrough Dialogue. Thank you so much for being here. I want to give a special welcome and thanks to our virtual guests. We are live streaming all over the world right now, so thank you to everyone who's tuning in virtually to be here. Before we get started, quick recommendation. If you're still here tomorrow morning, I would walk over to the bluffs and watch the sunrise. If it was anything like this morning, I saw several hundred pelicans flying underneath the Golden Gate Bridge, which felt like just a very eco-modernist portrait. Obviously, I would think that. We're really excited for the program today. We've got a couple plenary sessions in here. We've got some breakout sessions. We've got some free time this afternoon. We had a particular amount of fun organizing this first conversation. I think it's fair to say most of our plenary sessions don't have a moderator who's quite so much a protagonist in the conversation. But Ezra coined the term supply-side progressivism, which is the title of this conversation. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Ezra, Bhaskar, Virginia, and Sam.
I'll let you guys go first. All right. Well, hello, eco-modernists. Do you all use that term, actually? Do you wander around and... Well, thank you to everybody at Breakthrough for organizing this panel, which I'm very excited about. I won't spend too much time introducing us all. I'm Ezra Klein. I write for the New York Times. I'm joined by Virginia Pastoral, who has been writing about these issues long before the rest of us. The Future and Its Enemies came out in the 90s? 98, and has an amazing new Substack and has written more great books than I can count. And Sam Hammond, who's a terrific policy analyst at Niskanen and is convincing me that there will one day be a child tax credit expansion, but is also very good at poking holes in all my other ideas. And Bhaskar Sunkara, my old antagonist and now frenemy, who runs basically all like lefty publications, like through like one monopolistic. When you take over Dissent too, it's going to be really weird.
You know, there's power at scale. Centralization, yeah?
So we're going to talk through supply-side progressivism. As Alex mentioned, I'm in a slightly awkward position here as both the moderator and like the target of the panel. So I'm going to give a very quick riff on what it is that I think I'm talking about, and then ask my esteemed co-panelists to tell me all the problems with it, and then we'll go to you, and you can make statements rather than questions about all the problems with it, and we'll just kind of run it that way. So I began thinking about supply-side progressivism, or the idea that became it a couple years ago, when it felt to me first that the relationship between progressives and technology was breaking down. That there are problems you can solve through social insurance programs, problems you can solve through redistributing money around, but a lot of problems you can't solve that way, or at least the politics would be a lot easier if you get the technology right. So climate was sort of central in my thinking here. If you are able to make clean energy cheaper, more modular, more reliable, the politics of transitioning to clean energy become a whole lot easier. If all you can do is sacrifice, that's a much harder politics. In another area that I think about a lot, sort of animal rights and animal suffering, if we actually could do great plant-based and cell-based meats, that would make it a lot easier for people to transition off of factory farm-based meats. But this becomes true in a lot of areas. I've covered health insurance and healthcare for most of my career on the side of kind of pushing universal health insurance. But for a lot of people, I mean, most Americans have health insurance. So what matters for them, first and foremost, isn't just the cost of the insurance, but what it can buy them. And what matters for that is like, it's really different if you're spending, 15, 20% of GDP on health insurance that actually extends healthy life out to 95 for a lot of people, versus if you're spending 20% of GDP or 25% on healthcare that's no better than what we have today. So I began thinking a little bit about that. And then with sort of rising inflation and watching a lot and living in California, where a lot of good projects, good ideas fail to happen. So we got a bunch of money from the feds a couple years ago to do high-speed rail. You might have noticed nobody got here today on high-speed rail. It would have been neat if somebody had, but that didn't occur. You can't build houses, which has created an unbelievable housing problem in this state, which almost all of our politics now are downstream of. I was very taken with a very small thing that happened in San Francisco, where during the pandemic, like a lot of places, we set up this ability to have little parklets in the restaurants. So you could have this little spot and eat outside, and everybody loved it. It's great. So we decided that we were going to make this permanent. Everybody could have their parklets. The restaurants that had done all this investment in their parklets, they could keep them. That kicked off a regulatory process, which was not a crazy one. I mean, there were difficult questions here. The fire department said, we can't get to a bunch of places because of these parklets, or our trucks are too big, and so we can't, get to streets we need to get to. And are you guys going to be the ones who are responsible for somebody dying in a fire? The disability advocates noted there were a lot of accessibility problems now. The Transportation Authority noted that all these parklets were starving them of a ton of revenue because now you couldn't park there. So anyway, when the regulations came out, most of the parklets became illegal. And what had been 8 pages of regulations became 60. The point of all this is that the progressivism that I have been part of and am still part of and am familiar with thinks a lot about the demand side, thinks a lot about what is it that people need that we can subsidize. It doesn't think that much about what don't they have that we need to build, what don't they have that we need to, or what do we have what we need to have more of, and what do we need that hasn't been invented yet but could be with the right financing, regulatory structure. And there are, great success stories here. Even in the very recent past, this is not obviously it was not Progressive who launched this one, but Operation Warp Speed is an incredible achievement of the federal government. It shows what can be done when the incentives are well aligned. And so what I've been trying to do with supply-side progressivism isn't replace what has come before. I still think we need universal health insurance in a truer way than we have it. I still think we should have a great expansion of the child tax credit. But it is to focus progressives on a class of problems that I think we've stopped seeing. The supply of what we need, the ability to create things that we don't have yet but could use, and the recognition that it is often government, not always, but very often government and government regulations and government processes that make it very hard to build these things. That sometimes what you need is not simply to pass a bill that we should have something, but to recognize that actually the reason that passing a bill to have something hasn't worked is that we, for many good reasons and good intentions, have made those things too hard to build. And the example of that over and over now is blue state governance, where it just is not affordable enough to live in blue states for those states to actually have the moniker of progressivism they want to have. So I'll stop talking at that point, and I'll start with Virginia and ask all the panelists to tell me the problems of this idea, what we're not thinking of, why this can't be done the way I hope it might be, or just where they would like to see it go.
Well, I feel your pain, Ezra, because coming out of the sort of free market world, libertarian world, I call myself a classical liberal, I have always been a person who cared much more about regulation than about redistribution. I mean, I think there is such thing as inefficiently high tax rates, but I was never, that was not where I cared, because what I care is about laissez-faire, not laissez-faire economics, but what is laissez-faire? What does it literally mean? It literally means basically allow doing, let people do stuff. And I think that's what you've put your finger on coming from the other direction, that we spend enormous amounts of time in American politics fighting about tax rates and fighting about various redistribution things, and those are important, and but that's not where we're really hurting ourselves, making people of all incomes worse off, and particularly well, I don't know, particularly at the bottom, it depends on the regulation. And I also feel your pain on the parklets, because I moved to LA in 1986 from Boston. And when I lived in Boston and I worked by the waterfront, we used to go outside to eat lunch when it was like 40. Oh my God, it's 45 degrees. We can go out and eat our lunch and moved to LA, and there's no place to eat outside until the pandemic came along. And that's because of regulation. I think there are 3 problems that you face in the progressive coalition in sort of getting traction on this. First of all is the idea that regulation as an ideal, and specific regulations, is sacrosanct. A few years ago, I tweeted something to the effect of, because I write a lot about housing, and every regulation that makes housing scarcer and less affordable is justified by a good reason. Like, somebody never says, let's just do this so we make housing more expensive and less available. And what did people say in response? You want people to die in a fire. You want people to have, no standards. And it wasn't even because I have like a libertarian background. It was just like they love regulation. They love the idea of regulation. So, good luck with that culture war. The second thing is the conviction that democracy means veto power. And I think this is maybe eroded somewhat lately because people don't want the wrong people to have the veto power. But you see, participatory democracy, which that ideal, which in part was a reaction to the sort of Robert Moses school of building and running over people. It has created, what's been called victocracy, what long ago in the 90s Jonathan Rauch called demosclerosis, which is also just something that happens in politics. And there was this wonderful profile in the New York Times of this woman called Susan Kirsch in the Bay Area who's been fighting for 20 years to keep, at least 20 years, to keep, God forbid, 20 condos from being built on a vacant lot. And she's been very successful because California gives her that power. And the author, Connor Doherty, wrote, where many people see gridlock, she sees having her voice heard. And there are lots of people on the left as well as the right who have that view. The third thing that you face is self-interest. I was really surprised to learn that the construction unions in California are great supporters of CEQA, which is the California Environmental Quality Act, which is one of the big ways that you block any construction. I thought, how can that be? They're construction unions. They want construction, but they use it as a bargaining tool. And then the other thing is there are huge numbers of highly educated professionals who make their living off of this. They are the ones who make the environmental impact statements. They're the ones who conduct the archaeological surveys. They're the ones. And it's not that they think, oh, this is my job, therefore I'm going to be in favor of it. It's more that they come to take it for granted as the way the world works. And a lot of those people are the people who make blue states blue states. Now, so that's your problems in the progressive, your problems. Got to deal with that. The big fundamental problem that I would point to is the knowledge problem. The knowledge problem of what should we be doing? And this is the great Hayekian critique of progressive planning, picking winners, lack of, you don't know. Sometimes there's low-hanging fruit, but there's lots of things that could be done that you don't know about. And so if this is all about people, imposing their technocratic solutions, you have a problem. I do think there are reasons for hope. One you've already mentioned, which is Operation Warp Speed, which I think is really a good model of thinking about what can government do to make something that we all agree on should happen. And the fact that it comes from the Trump administration, Trump doesn't seem to really want to claim credit for it, so go ahead and embrace it, because it should be the talking point of talking points among Republicans, but it's not. The other is I'm old enough to remember 1970s inflation, which produced some really interesting coalitions that led to such things as trucking deregulation, which not only saved just billions and billions and billions of dollars by making things more efficient. Also, we didn't know it then, but it's good for the climate because you're no longer driving empty trucks around. Airline deregulation is more famous. Again, and my favorite is that there was the Reagan FTC went after the state laws that prevented the advertising of eyeglasses. And this is dear to my heart because I was a little girl who couldn't afford eyeglasses. And my ophthalmologist told my parents, look, her eyes are going to change and you should wait to get her these glasses. And I spent the 3rd grade borrowing the girls next to me's glasses so I could see the board. And so this reduction in the cost of eyeglasses is something that came out of this. There was this coalition in the 70s, partly because of fighting inflation, between consumerist progressives and free market, call them conservatives or libertarians, to say, what can we do to make things better for consumers using government or using government out of the way? So I'll end there. Eyeglasses, good. Zenny, very good.
Sam.
Wow. So I think supply-side progressivism is obviously a great idea. I wonder to what extent it is contained to the op-ed pages of the New York Times and actually influencing how things are being done in Congress. Because when I look around, we had a paper come out last year called Cost to Seize Socialism, where we said that, if the left's old rallying cry was seize the means of production, today's rallying cry is subsidize my cost of living. And you see this as a very expedient option. We have high housing costs, high childcare costs, higher education costs, and the route that politicians want to take, including the Biden administration, is subsidize demand while restricting supply. And that's a very predictable formula for rising prices. And you even see it today with inflation. It's being blamed on corporate greed. Our solution to gas prices is to send everyone a rebate card, which we can't even do because there's not enough chips to put in the cards. So it's that's one of the few supply chain issues that's actually disinflationary. And there's not a real reckoning with the hard choices that have to be made. Virginia is totally right that on the left there is a predisposition to favor regulation, but when you break it down, this isn't ideological, it's interest driven. And there's a very cliched observation that Republicans are more ideological and Democrats are more interest and coalition driven. And you're seeing the Biden administration struggle because they just refuse to piss off any member of the coalition. And so when we have a massive infant formula crisis, in part owing to progressive era, 70s era progressive reforms that you could frame as supply-side progressivism at the time, because the idea was we're going to use these convoluted rebates to manufacturers so we have a robust supply of infant formula, but then suddenly you have a monopoly that is the only company that supplies infant formula. The solution is to marshal the Defense Production Act, right? To fly around the world finding fake baby milk, and rather than just letting us import European formula, which we don't currently allow. Laissez-faire would be a big improvement. But the reason those decisions are hard, and the reason they're not happening, is not because they're not persuaded by supply-side progressivism or the need to push on the supply side. It's because the political economy just simply doesn't allow it. And that's going to be the hard problem going forward. After we wrote our cost disease paper, Alex wrote a great review of it where he sort of played on it in the environmental context, cost disease environmentalism, where it's a very similar story. We want more windmills, we want more solar panels that subsidize the hell out of it, but where are the transmission lines to actually get that in the grid? That's something the Scandinavia Center works a lot on, trying to update FERC and some of these very antiquated systems where you literally can't build the transmission lines to get energy from where the sun is bright to where homes need to be heated. And I don't think utility CEOs are particularly leftist or rightist or anything. They probably have no opinions at all on these issues. We're really in a classic kind of wicket problem, and historically the only ways that you break out of these paradigms is crisis. And one of my sources of deep pessimism is we've just went through a massive crisis fractal crises really, and while we did great stuff on vaccines and stuff like that, what would have been in the Great Depression a motivation to create Social Security or like to create really broad-based reforms, we're seeing just tinkering around the margins, and so I think it's right now a very noble cause, but also kind of notional, and I want to see it get down to brass tacks. On my work on child poverty, Niskanin's a big advocate of child benefits, and we work with Senator Romney on his child allowance proposal. And his proposal, because it's coming from a conservative perspective, would consolidate some other welfare programs to fund it, and nonetheless it would cut child poverty significantly. And when we first proposed that, we got a phone call from a leading child anti-poverty advocacy group saying, even though our program would cut child poverty by 30%, the first thing out of their mouth was, why are you funding this on the backs of the poor, right? And so it's not just pecuniary interest, it's also in part the advocacy world. And to the extent that the United States outsources so much policy development, not just to policy shops, but to issue advocacy groups, which on the left have their own problems, as the Intercept just recently covered. It makes it very difficult to do the kind of coordinating role where some people are benefiting, some people are losing, and it shakes out to a better equilibrium. Because all these groups have something in their mission statement that is their sole issue, and they're not going to compromise. And in the case of climate, it's become really clear that we're at a sort of crossroads where we're going to have to choose between what do we care about more, the environment or the climate. Do we care about the rare species of buckwheat in Nevada that is a few miles from one of the largest lithium reserves in the Western Hemisphere? Or do we care about having abundant rare metals to supply EVs for the next 200 years? And the choices we're making are to basically not just kick the can, but to sort of hide the ball. We're totally willing to import this from the DRC or from other countries, but that doesn't actually solve any of the conservation issues or environmental issues. But it does if you're that parochial local interest group. And to the extent that a lot of this is an endemic feature of the modern American state, it is this citizen voice problem. It is this diffusion of power and accountability. If supply-side progressivism is a new idea, the trendiest idea on the left right now is stakeholder capitalism, which is, in a sense, trying to take that citizen voice model and bring it to the corporate sector, where we have some of the few remaining functional institutions. So this is a really, really uphill battle. And I applaud you for the work you're doing, but I think if there's any rich people here, like Ezra needs a security detail because he's one of the few people who's woke to the problem, and is listened to by the people who matter.
Bhaskar?
Well, I hate to begin panels with throat clearing, but I'm going to agree with my arch nemesis, Ezra Klein, and with some of the speakers before on the other side of the political spectrum. So I think it's worth remembering. I sometimes recall this, I think it's Frederick Jameson quote, and it goes like, under capitalism, the only thing worse than being exploited by capital is not being exploited by capital. And I think nowadays when we think about the new wave of democratic socialism in the US and the politics of people like AOC and others that identify as socialists, we often think immediately to just the redistribution of goods. And of course, it's true that socialists want to redistribute goods and redistribute wealth and power. But it used to be taken for granted that one of the primary socialist arguments against capitalism wasn't that modernity was a threat, but rather that capitalism had become, in certain instances, a fetter on development itself. So it was both creating the preconditions for something better than capitalism, but unable to fully get there. So to unfetter production, we would need socialism. Obviously, a lot of those particular attempts and movements ran into dead ends, but they were rooted politically in both a producerist spirit that said that when you build things, when you produce things, you're not only just empowering the forces of capital, you're valorizing the people who create those things and giving them power too. Giving them power just not as people receiving like a universal basic income and being the recipient of things and able to consume as consumers, but power at the point of production. And that was also tied, I think, to the premise of growth and progress. You would never be able to win over even a minority social base in society unless you were able to tell people that what you were advocating was a route for them to be able to live better lives and have more things and be more secure. But that security was, again, tied to their role as workers. So, in other words, I think it's perfectly in sync with a classically socialist vision to say that we should be focused on building supply as a precondition for how we debate, how we redistribute those goods and that power in society. It is a precondition. And I worry that in America we kind of are going into the worst of both worlds. And this is kind of, seems like a random aside, but I think sometimes about the difference in development models of post-war India compared to, let's say, the developmental states of countries like South Korea and Taiwan, in that they were both models that leaned very heavily on the state. But whereas in India, the state was used to both subsidize industry and subsidize consumers, there was no real long-term way to discipline capital and investment priorities. Whereas in South Korea, there was famously, that's mostly apocryphal, threats of the death penalties against capitalists for violating certain state planning norms, but also a much more, a much greater emphasis on harnessing growth and harnessing and shaping investment. And I think to the extent I would not necessarily push back, but say that I think a lot of what we're discussing is not incompatible with a stronger state and building state capacity. It's also not incompatible with building even stronger unions. It's just about a matter of avoiding this worst of both worlds situation. So in the US, it's not that we have an excessively strong state, we just have multiple layers of state authority, this federalist mismatch of local, state, and federal rules and restriction that makes it hard to figure out how to build something in one part of the country and scale it up to the rest of the country. It's not that we have too high labor costs and too powerful unions, it's that where we do have pockets of union strength in the country, those unions don't exert power through sectoral wage bargaining and through making arrangements with employers in the state at a grand scale. They can only exert that power at kind of the micro level. It's not that we have too much democracy, it's that instead of having strong associational democracy that comes from being in trade unions, being active in mass political parties, being part of election campaigns that have consequences, we instead exert democracy through small assemblies of people that meet at 5:30 p.m. and can have the spare time to get together, mostly middle class people, and obstruct projects. So we live in a society in which we have this strong civic culture of let's go sue someone to slow something down, and we focus, I think, too much sometimes on the negative consequences, the externality of development, be it state infrastructure projects or development in the private sector, instead of focusing on the cost of inaction, then figuring out how to have that battle over the distribution of power and resources after we actually have something to distribute. So I think, in essence, everything that Ezra laid out in his article, which I guess was initially titled Supply Side Progressivism for like 15 minutes before the New York Times copy editors decided it was bad SEO and they changed it to something else. But in that article, I think we could get behind. The question is then, or what kind of model are you going to use to build this kind of society that is willing to build things? And when I think about the successful models of socialists and social democrats in power, when I think about the Nordic countries, these are not countries that are very invested in heavy-handed state regulation and centralized state planning. They're using the vehicles often of centralized wage bargaining to shape investment priorities, with a role from the state flowing from there. So again, there's different ways in which we could build a model in the United States that can build things. We just need to kind of figure out and have people on left, right, and center with their own coherent vision, instead of being stuck right in here where we are now, where nothing gets done and nobody is responsible for nothing getting done.
So I think that's a great place to launch in. So let me offer one point of, not optimism, I think this is a kind of realism, but then we'll go into the harder pieces. So something I've heard a lot is that, well, if you look at the distribution of interests on the left, or for that matter, actually on the right, nothing can change, because to change it, you'd have to disappoint this or that group. And something I have come to believe over my time covering politics is, I forgot who this line is attributed to, that everybody overestimates what they can do in a year and underestimates what they can do in 10. Political coalitions and their priorities and their beliefs really change. They change more than I would have thought they did. If you had asked me to predict this 10 years ago, I would have gotten it wrong. Like, I used to be, in the early to mid-aughts, I was like a real big anti-filibuster guy. And that was a genuinely idiosyncratic view to hold that was opposed by, as far as I could tell, everybody on the right, but also everybody on the left, or at least in the Democratic Party. In part because there were these groups, right, who had been using the filibuster forever to defend themselves against things that didn't want to happen. But over the course of like 10 years of people arguing about this in the punditariat, notionally, I think that last year we were probably 2 to 5 votes away from getting rid of the filibuster. I mean, it was a shocking level of change. Or a similar version, and even one that implicates interest groups even more directly, is immigration on the right. I mean, forever the view has been that because the business interests on the right want immigration reform, we were eventually going to get it. And certainly the right couldn't become nativist, because the Chamber of Commerce was on the right, because all these corporate groups that relied on immigrant labor were on the right. Anyway, here we are now. And things change. And housing, I think, is also a place where there should be some reason for optimism here. The people who started out, and Virginia's been on this a long time, my friend Matt Iglesias has been on this a long time. The people were arguing, 8-10 years ago for housing as a supply problem, for there being a real issue here, particularly in blue states that had gotten wrong. I mean, that was an unusual argument back then. Housing was still understood as we don't have enough Section 8 vouchers on the left. And now if you look at California, you really do see legislative change happening in a big way. I mean, the bill basically making at least everything in the state more or less zoned into a duplex. That'll have to be actually implemented, but that's a big deal. The ADA bills are big deals. You want to go further, but that stuff wasn't happening a bit ago. In Minnesota, they passed a bill getting rid of single-family zoning, which is now, of course, there's an injunction against that because of environmental lawsuits. But it's progress of a sort, and they'll get through that injunction. So I just want to note that things change. Like, there isn't stasis in politics. The coalitions are not what they were 10 years ago, to say nothing of 30 years ago, right? I mean, we're about to see probably Roe gutted, and where the coalitions were on that, 30, 40 years ago is really, really different. So I think that we should have a little more optimism, or at least a little bit more of a sense there is flexibility in these systems, not fast enough for anybody who does policy professionally. We all want to see the change happen quickly, but such that things can actually change more than we think. But that gets to something I think really is hard, which is interests can change and coalitions can change, but processes are really hard to change. How governments work is really hard to change. The idea that you would change, the number of points of voice, which are also ultimately points of veto, in local governments would seem a little crazy. The idea that you would actually radically change how regulation or structures in the federal government work nobody wants to use their scarce political capital on that, right? They want something where they can say, hey, I signed a check and you got the check. So I'll put this to you to start, Virginia, because you've been part of these arguments for a long time about demosclerosis and the way stable societies develop all this crust and Mansur-Olson.
Right.
And how do you think about process change? Not the change where you have the problem is interests disagree or there's an ideological fight, but the change where the way things are built now just by nature advantages the status quo.
Yeah, it's really, really hard. And
damn.
if you go back to Mansur-Olson, his model was post-war Japan. So it was like it opened up because you got bombed and everything got destroyed, and and so the veto players, there was this moment where you had a change. So it is hard. I think partly, I don't know if this changes process, but it might. I mean, what you're talking about with interest groups, partly it changes because of generational experiences and generational changes. And I think what we're seeing on housing in California, while all this bad effect, honest to God, I anticipated this in 1987. If you start telling every new building in LA that it's got to have a whole bunch of parking, it's gonna be a problem, But and there was this whole anti-growth thing that happened then. But why is it now we're changing? It's because there were all these people who were born in that period and are now adults and are now and have grown up in California and want to stay in California and can't because they can't afford a place to live. And so that is putting a lot of pressure. It's not all natives, but there's a lot. That's one of the things that's changed. And so that then leads to it does partly lead to new processes. Another thing that has happened is there's been a shift in the planning profession. If you went back in the past, and this I don't know as much on the ground, but the planners were obstacles to doing things, and now they're much more likely to be on the side of doing things and against the. But the process stuff is hard because reversing something that says, if we were to say we're going to get rid of CEQA or significantly reform it, even though there are lots and lots of people who would benefit from that, it's very hard to do. So I don't have an easy answer, sorry.
Sam, let me ask you about the politics of this on the right. So I think it is a commonly held view on the right that Democrats have destroyed every city in this country by restricting supply. I think it's a commonly held view on the right that Democrats over-regulate. Elon Musk is now Republican and he likes to build things. And there's a lot of inflation. So you need not just short-term answers, but long-term ideas about what you're going to do about inflation. And yet I don't actually see, as I try to watch, a lot of, certainly at the national Republican level, a lot of thinking about supply going on, a lot of thinking about, there aren't a lot of Republican bills for more warp speeds. One, am I just missing it? But two, how do you think about supply-side conservatism at this point? Is it taking any new forms? Are there new ideas emerging or new figures emerging in it?
Yeah, totally. I mean, to your first point, I think more warp speeds for more projects is exactly the kind of fallacy of supply-side progressivism that I worry about, where instead of letting European infant formula in, we have a warp speed for infant formula. And you see this a lot of the way the supply-side stuff on the left is cashed out is like, oh, we need more childcare centers. Rather than trying to reduce the price of land and labor, like let's have a Marshall Plan for nurseries. It's kind of wackadoo. But on the right, Mike Lee has his Unshackle Act, which is a full-scale restructuring of how NEPA works, right? There's a Republican-led bill to add the NEPA exclusions. There's categorical exclusions where you don't have to do all the environmental review that currently only apply for oil and gas, and to add geothermal, right? Because drilling a hole for natural gas and drilling a hole for geothermal are not that distinct of a process. So those ideas actually are alive on the right. They don't call themselves supply-side conservatives; they just call themselves conservatives, or they call themselves supply-siders. But one of the issues is, like, the original supply-siders were focused on marginal tax rates, which was really a misnomer because that was a kind of right-wing Keynesianism, not really a supply-side thing. But you can only cut taxes so many times, and we're at the point where all the main barriers are structural. So I'm totally with you. Like, there shouldn't be a legislative filibuster. And if we got rid of it, there would be some, shaky interim process where, one day we have Medicare for all, and the next day we have like some free market healthcare system, and then we go back and forth, and then eventually it'll shake out. But in lieu of that, we've sort of entered this sort of, fiscalist state by as path of least resistance. We can pass $4 trillion stimulus and infrastructure packages, which just spend a ton of money, but we can't reform the Administrative Procedures Act, right? So I am with you that there are some notes of optimism. I think one of the biggest is just generational turnover. So much of this is both locked in cultures, but also personnel's policy, and the boomers have held on for a long time. And the average age of a Fortune 500 CEO has increased 15 years over the past 15 years, right? So there's going to be a new generation that comes in that have very different ideas and very different formative experiences, and that's where I'm placing my bets. So I am looking at 10 years, not to the next Congress necessarily, but there is a scenario, a very dark scenario, where we kind of enter a new middle income trap, right? Like, a lot of this is, you can think of this as developmentalism. Like, I think of myself as a developmentalist. Like, you look at how countries develop, it's by building these encompassing coalitions, as Mansur Olson would call them, sort of pro-growth coalitions. It's not that exports were particularly important. It's that export-led growth created interest groups that had a stake in rising productivity and living standards. So in some sense, there is a case for, on the right even, for doing some of the things Bhaskar might like on labor law reform. One of the only groups that are looking at broad-based clean slate labor law reform is American Compass, which is a conservative organization. And one of the reasons that would be good is because we had moved from a system where you have very parochial unit, firm-based unions that fight for their own interest rather than a broader class interest, to a system where you have entire sectors or industries that are being a rising tide. You can't get that on the left, obviously, because we had one of the biggest supply chain crises in history, and ships docked outside the LA port, and a maritime union contract that just happened to be coming up for renegotiation, and crickets from the White House about what to do about that. So they're taking a pro-union position, but not necessarily a pro-labor position. And so in some sense, I think the right maybe are only hope on some of this stuff because they don't have all the baggage that the left has.
Bhaskar, let me ask you about something that Virginia touched on. She was saying that in the 80s, you could see in LA and on the left this whole anti-growth thing. And that hasn't really gone away as a tension. Degrowth, which I know is a favorite topic and a popular idea in this room, but has a lot of its adherents on the left. I mean, when I'm wandering around degrowth Twitter, it's not a lot of Trump voters. But there is on the left there is, and I want to take it seriously because it neither is always wrong now nor has always been wrong. A view that one, growth is a capitalist idea, that it's capitalist economies that need constant growth to keep going. But two, that it's a reckless idea, that we don't understand the ways in which we're changing the natural world, that the way growth is planned, who decides what is going to get built and how we're going to grow, that because that is so driven by capital that we should be skeptical of how those decisions are made, because government is often captured by corporate interests. Can you talk a little bit about the tensions around growth on the left and how you either try to navigate them or see them shaking out around some of these questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this has to do with just the fact that a broad coalition from liberals to the right decided to help crush the Socialist Party of America and later the Communist Party, and we ended up with the left that emerged after it, which drew a lot from lowercase l kind of localism and drew a lot from certain notions that have more in common, I think, with conservatism in certain regards than with some of the classically socialist visions, which again tied prosperity, whether you're trying to inject doses of socialism within capitalism or you're trying to build a socialism after capitalism, tied their project to true prosperity and to a social base. And a social base needs to be won over by something. So if your left is disproportionately locked into NGOs and they're accountable to just each other's and to their funders, they're going to probably have a very different rhetoric than the rhetoric you hear from even politicians like Bernie Sanders that actually have a base. And ordinary people more or less want the same things. They want jobs, they want prosperity, they want rising standards of living. It is true, obviously, that there's been a lot of projects, both state projects and projects from private capital, that have had unforeseen and disastrous consequences. I'm not advocating that we dam every river. I think we should dam some of them. But I think that there's this emphasis on what happens when capital does something wrong, what happens when the state does something wrong, and not enough about the slow sort of decay of certain parts of the country and the slow decay of ordinary people not being able to find jobs, then trying to get degrees they don't really need for the job market, getting trapped into debt, not really having sort of options. So I think on the left, to the extent that there is this degrowth trend, there is this kind of small c conservative trend against development, I think that it's been fading somewhat because of Bernie Sanders, because of what I hope to be, contributing through Jacobin and other allies what we're contributing to, which is, I think we could agree with it or disagree with it, a more traditional kind of Marxist inflection, which might sound counterintuitive that this is how you win over working class people on a left that had lost its working class base. But you could say anything you want about Marxism. We are materialists.
Let me pick up on that, Virginia. When I went back to The Future and Its Enemies, what I realized is that I'm one of the enemies.
Yes,
we sound superficially aligned on this panel, but
I
I really count as a technocrat.
Yes, you do.
And
build a bridge to the future.
Build a bridge to the future. And one of the things I'm pushing on that I think that probably Basco would agree with, but that you may not, is that one, it's good to, I actually do think we should let more people do more things. So I'm only like 45% an enemy of the future, but
it's really a spectrum.
It's a spectrum.
It's not.
Yeah.
I mean,
the future and its frenemies.
The categories are, analytical.
But I do think that one problem is that first, growth doesn't always know where it's going. It's not my view that simply consumer preferences give you enough of an answer. And I think one reason that the growth orientation on the left is changing, and in this room, what brings a lot of people here is climate. And without the correct signal set from somewhere aside from the market, I think you see that we will grow in a pretty disastrous direction. And in general, I think we've somewhat lost the recognition that you need some goals in society that are not going to come through a Hayekian price setting mechanism. Now, you can try to use a price setting mechanism to get there, but they're not going to arrive naturally. So I'm curious how you think about that. How do you think about the things that do need to be planned or thought about? I mean, Elon Musk, SpaceX is great, but it doesn't happen without NASA and a view about what we should be doing from a public dimension. So what role does the public play in the future for you and goal setting beyond prices?
Well, I think that the critical question here is, how do you get feedback about what's working? Because we can come up with a million possibly good ideas, but how do you know whether something is actually better or not when you try it? And then going to process question, and this is a question that Jonathan's book grapples with, but he's kind of a counsel of despair. If something's not working, how do you correct it? And the market is better at that most of the time because competition. So then the question is there a way that you can take some of those mechanisms or those and apply them to things where you have some kind of market failure, and of course people go, oh, you have cap and trade, and there are lots of political problems and other problems with that as a simple answer. But I think that paradigm, that thinking about, because one of the things that markets do is that they allow, and it's not just markets, it's also things in the culture that are non-monetary and not traded, is you get the surfacing of things that people don't realize, that a top-down person just wouldn't realize are there. And it could be a good new idea, it could be a good, bad new idea potentially. And so part of what I'm trying to do, and I wrote this book when I was many years ago, but it's a very good book. But it's almost like it was written by a different person in the sense that I'm sort of objective about it now. It's sort of objective.
It's objectively a good book, is what you're saying.
I mean, I think it is, but anyway, I mean, something like climate is an issue because it happens later. You don't realize until it's pretty late. And I think that's as Charles Kennedy said last night, the solutions to the new problems aren't to go back to the old problems. And so partly what I'm saying is the solution to the new problem can't go back to the old problem. But the mindset that I'm opposing, when I'm opposing the technocrats like you, is exactly what Sam was talking about, which is that you think you know the answer, and so you make this complicated kind of warp speed for infant formula, as opposed to say, I mean, it's one thing when you don't have vaccines and you know you need vaccines, and then you think about the incentives and what can the government do to make that more happen. But we have infant formula, so you don't need to run it through the technocrats. You could just say, our thing is like, we'll let it come in from Europe. So partly I'm trying to do is get people like you to think about, not necessarily to come over to being exactly like me, but to think about like, when is the knee-jerk reaction to plan from the top maybe not the best approach. So because that's where a lot of this regulatory crud comes from. If I could just say a couple of things. One is that I think there were lots of people who voted for Donald Trump because they wanted to build. They saw him as a builder. I mean, I did a piece for the Washington Post about the glamour of Donald Trump for people who voted for him, and I can't stand Donald Trump, but I do like a lot of the people who voted for him. I mean, they're not all horrible people. Some of them are people who just are super frustrated with this. And the other thing is, I don't know that I agree with your history. I think that this comes out of the New Left, which was people who were, it's associated with baby boomers, but the people were actually and there were the people who grew up in the little boxes made of ticky-tacky and thought they were icky. And so it was like the success of the New Deal project of, uplift of, and they, it was like The Graduate, plastics.
Well, that actually brings up something that I think is a very tricky question in all this, which is how much are we talking about, on some level, not only, but on some level, a disease of affluence?
Yeah.
Something that always occurs to me. So if you look at housing politics are very fractal. So on the one hand, you see a lot of supply constraints and a lot of resistance to change in like richer areas of the country. But then if you zoom into, say, that rich city, you will find that you find much more supply constraint and much more resistance to change in the richer area of the city. And so you can do a lot more in, say, Anacostia in DC than you can do in Georgetown. And one way of looking at this that I think is like a slightly more persuasive view than like the Mansur-Olson rise and fall of nations, rise and decline of nations, because a bunch of stuff in his empirics don't end up working out. What you would predict from simply length of stability doesn't end up working. But that is actually when you have a small d democratic system that gets pretty rich, and this goes to your point about the new left, at a certain point people's desires become either defensive or non-materialistic. And that's actually one of the, people on the left want politics to be more materialistic. To some degree, I often see people on the right ultimately wanting politics in a way to be more materialistic. But what everybody keeps running into is that a lot of people don't want things to change because it's good enough for them now. And change has become the enemy. So I'm curious how you think about that, Sam, as somebody who's professionally pro-change. Because this is not just a left problem. Like, this is very much an affluence problem.
I agree and disagree, but France is also a rich country, but they can still build rail systems, and they also have high rates of unionization. So that's not the problem either, right?
But there's a lot of things.
That's the only thing they can do in
but
France.
There's a lot of. But I actually want to push on this because I agree with you, and I use the French rail system example too. But that's where I think processes end up really mattering. Processes operate somewhat separately from ideology. There's a lot of stuff France can't do. France is not understood, and the view of France on the right is not like it's a hotbed of dynamic change.
No. I think there are you can build a train, but you can't fire anybody.
Right.
But getting to Denmark is, I think, we probably share that goal for different reasons. But the proceduralism is a really big issue. I sometimes call myself a New Deal conservative, which is like an oxymoron for some people. But if you really try to start thinking about it, I was just at the Computer Museum in Mountain View. And it was really interesting because it sort of illustrated the extent to which in the early 20th century, the Department of Defense ran like a startup and IBM ran like a military unit. They had marches, they all wore uniforms. And some of the growth and of state capacity at that era was this sort of feedback loop between business and government to try to learn how to scale, learn best management practices, and actually have sort of the hierarchy that you need to make robust decisions. Post the New Left and the counterculture, part of it was a shift in ideology, but it was also a breakdown in trust. And proceduralism ultimately arises out of a lack of trust. If you can't just put the best person in charge and say, we're not going to tell you how to do it, but we just want this outcome, instead you get FDA regulations that basically hamstring our ability to respond to a pandemic, and no one in charge to say, let's use some discretion here, right? Instead of going through these 2-year rulemakings and so forth. So in some ways, we need to get back to that New Deal era, and that requires learning the mistakes of the post-70s era, which were rooted in this lack of trust, which unfortunately continues to decline. We had this is the 50th anniversary of Watergate, but in some ways, trust is even lower now, in part because of the internet and he's shining a light on every single, Cuomo who's sexually harassing people. You know everything about every politician, and we're so polarized. Which you have a book explaining why we're polarized, but that polarization is I think needs to be overcome almost as a prerequisite to getting back to that different model where we can just put somebody in charge and trust them.
I'm gonna, this will be the last answer, and then we're gonna move to Q&A, and Ted and Alex, I believe, are gonna be the folks with the mics, which is, I think, an impressively flat hierarchy in the Breakthrough organization. But I wanna put what Sam said to you, Bhaskar, which is, how do you think about, I was gonna say affluence, but I actually think trust is interesting, because when I look at sort of the way the left thinks about this, I don't think of the left as being pro-increasing trust and autonomy for players in these organizations. Do you think we want more trust? Do you think we want less, more, how do you make politics more materialistic but also more dynamic?
So on the one hand, when it comes to trust in the state, I think some portions of the left are undermining their wider project when they focus on, let's say, the New Deal being a very good thing but being a little bit flawed is a different message than saying the New Deal was inherently racist. And I think there's been a lot of myths propagated about the Social Security Administration and a host of things in how our welfare state was constructed that, one, distract from places where the New Deal did fail, more particularly like in housing later on, in later stages. But also, I think, just gets us into a corner where you say you want a bigger state, but you also say the state can't be trusted. So where does that go politically? When it comes to the private sector, and more generally things like people getting fired from work or firms failing, and inefficient firms, obviously, in a good society, we would want inefficient firms to fail. But it becomes easier to allow that sort of firm failure when people know that they could rely on a universal welfare state in a period of unemployment. And when you actually have functioning active labor market policies, not just the way it's occasionally awkwardly invoked at a Democratic Party debate every 4 years, kind of meaninglessly. So I think that part of the trust, it is kind of a chicken or the egg problem, but I do think that part of the trust can come from having the sort of state where people see that if private sector failure might mean something better in the future, it might mean more revenue for society as a whole and for the government, but your healthcare isn't tied to your employer, so it becomes a little bit easier to accept that certain firms deserve to be exposed to competitive pressure, and that might be better in a broader social democratic, framework. But I think a lot of the left internally just needs to think about what sort of model of a good society they want. Whereas right now, I feel like a lot of the left, or the liberal left more broadly, is stuck in a period of permanent, resistance.
Great. So we're going to go to Q&A now. I believe what we're going to do this is we're going to take a couple questions, wrap them together, and then I'm going to match the demand of questions with the supply of panelists up here according to my own whims.
Hi, thank you so much. This was really very inspiring on lots of levels. My name is Jennifer Hernandez. I'm a Breakthrough board member. I'd like to ask you guys about the issue of race, because the people who are hurt by our paralysis are disproportionately browner. And our debate, prolonging paralysis, is causing harms, as a sequel litigator, by the way, and Berkeley Dem Union family member, really harm the same people that were on the wrong side of separate but equal. Or let's condemn Chavez Ravine again. Or hey, Cabrini Green, great idea, wipe out black homeowners. I don't know that either side is particularly comfortable being racist, but I would argue that the status quo is very racist. And I wonder if that's a wedge issue that might open up the dialogue a bit and create opportunities to build for those who don't have, who are browner.
I'm going to pull a couple together if I'm right.
Hey, thanks. Great conversation. I was very convinced by a whole lot of it. I'm Mezanon, clean tech author, speaker, and investor. I would just like to point out that not all of the barriers to building things we need are from the left. So in the case of transmission, for instance, every climate model says building coast-to-coast high-voltage transmission would massively increase the amount of renewables we put on the grid at lower cost, higher reliability. But that doesn't get built because Congress, or Republican Congress, granted the power to every state that a long-range transmission line crosses to veto that. And when you look at who's vetoing it, it's red states. Second reason it doesn't get built is because we have this model of vertically integrated monopoly utilities who control both power generation in their region and transmission, and have zero incentive to open up the transmission from anyone else to transit, because it steals potential revenue from their power generation that the customers are locked into. So there's a variety of these places where it's more the right, and there's some, like building solar and wind farms, run afoul. They do get hit by NEPA, which is on the left, but they get hit by NIMBY in red states and blue. So while I think your thesis goes really far, I think it's not just the left. And I would actually say, look, NEPA reform, or reform of those laws that give states the right to veto transmission, aren't, I assume we're going to keep the filibuster, so they're not ever going to get passed unless there's a compromise. Unless the Dems offer to the GOP, we're going to loosen federal restrictions on gas and oil infrastructure in exchange for giving FERC the power to control where transmission goes, and maybe federalizing the standards for how communities and states can reject or not reject other energy infrastructure. Well, that's what I, maybe that's naive, but that's one of the only ways I can imagine that getting fixed right now.
So Bhaskar, let me put the first one to you, because I think I'd like to hear your thoughts a little bit on, and I would put it this way to kind of put a little bit of spin on the question, the way the left, which I do think thinks more about the racial disparities of outcomes in this country, the way there is some conflict between sort of the processes we're increasingly building to ensure representation, and the way then sort of it's very actually hard to make changes to the status quo because we're very process oriented.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, we don't need more talk about racial disparities necessarily, in part because we're trying to convey a message that a program of jobs, prosperity, and good government helps everyone, and we need to kind of prevent it from being siloed as kind of a special interest thing. And also, in either case, the determining factor here isn't actually race, it's people being lower income and being hurt because of the status quo because they're lower income. Obviously, the sorting in our labor market is derived in part because of institutional racism of the past, but racism today, day to day, isn't really the thing keeping people in that portion of the labor market. It's just kind of the same factors keeping everyone stuck at the bottom of the labor market, which is really hard to move up. Now, I do think that there's a question of voice in terms of allowing people and encouraging people to take part in democracy, which is a good thing. But the question is whether we're trying to build democracy at scale, where there can be people who organize together, put forward their point of views, and there's democratic contests in terms of like elections or other forms of mass politics, versus right now where we have democracy at a very small scale, which leads to vetoes and choke points. And I'm not convinced that a lot of what passes for democracy in the US is really democracy. It's the tyranny of people who have time. And often that's more affluent people, often that's middle class people, often it's retirees, it's people who don't have, two kids and can, and aren't able to get off work until 7 p.m.
And Sam, what about the supply constraints that come from the right?
Well, I mean, Texas utility regulation is its own can of worms. I mean, like I mentioned earlier, Niskanen, our climate team is deep in FERC and working on bills and embedded with the committee and really trying to address this problem. Part of it is this issue of needing a new sort of federalism, a new compact around what are the state and federal responsibilities. Totally agree, and like I said earlier, I don't think utility regulators are particularly political one way or the other. They're just looking at, they're playing by the rules and playing to their incentives. To the race question, as I mentioned, I work on family benefits and child poverty and issues like that. One of the things that have come out of the CTC debate was just how, expanding the child tax credit cut child poverty by 40%, huge disproportionate benefit to Black and brown families who had historically been cut out of the credit because they're lower income. Incredible progress on that dimension of equity. Yet poll after poll after poll showed that messaging around the race forward messaging actually was detrimental to its support and passage. And you see this across the board. So we have to sort of decide, do we want to be signaling the right virtues, or do we actually want to achieve certain outcomes, right? And a good example, housing is a great example of this, where things like reparations are increasingly popular on the left, and sort of this very tax-based redistribution model. But housing, the increase in housing costs was a $4 trillion wealth redistribution that didn't go through the IRS. It went through prices. And then you zoom back, and I am a sort of believer in structural racism, and one of the things about it being structural is it's not necessarily attitudinal, right? Maybe Alabama is a little attitudinally racist, but the structural racism emerged out of New Haven, Connecticut, right? and New Jersey. Like these places, if you break it down, are the most racially segregated cities, and the Southwest with its sort of nonchalant attitude to these questions and the level of rhetoric, it ends up being a much better place for equal opportunity.
Good to take some more questions here. We've got a couple minutes left.
Just briefly to go back to the question of race in building, we haven't addressed environmental justice issues. And I mean, as we've seen with the Justice 40 reports that the Biden administration authorized, there was a lot of justifications, for example, that carbon capture pipelines shouldn't be built, hydrogen pipelines are questionable, nuclear is questionable because of legacy environmental justice issues regarding these sectors, or the fact that these communities oftentimes just completely got rolled over the last, 100+ years and didn't have a voice, in part because they didn't have the time to go show up at the hearings, or there wasn't a process. So from the left, how do we square the need to build a lot more with a vocal, empowered, and rising environmental justice movement that is saying, wait a second, we need to run through a number of processes first?
And Virginia, I'd like to hear you on this, because one thing I think that also gets at is that when you do just let people do things, often it's the people with more power and pull in society who like to put things where the people with less power live. So how do you think about that trade-off of process is protective, and dynamism as generative?
Well, I think that, I think that the environmental justice movement is a great example of exactly what you're talking about, which is people with time and highly educated professional. For the most part, I mean, yes, there are grassroots people, but it's usually a way of kind of opposing things that are going to locations because they need something cheap. So that you need cheap land for something. And it's going to be in a poor neighborhood. That's why the poor people live there, because the land is cheap. Now, if you want to do something to compensate them for whatever spillovers there might be, but I have to say I'm quite skeptical of a lot of environmental justice arguments. I'm not saying they're never correct, and there's certainly legacies where it's a matter of, again, technocrats having jammed something someplace. But I don't think the fundamental problems are mostly market problems, other than, I mean, it sucks to be poor. It sucks to be poor, and you end up living in places that have some kind of disamenity, because that's why it's affordable. That disamenity can be slum housing, it can be crime, it can be being next to a factory, but sometimes some of these things bring jobs closer, which is a plus. I mean, not
But
always.
even
but,
if you don't like
I
the
mean,
groups,
but I want
you-
I want to think about one thing that I wrote about where I got jammed. People, oh, how can you say that? So I wrote about the Port of LA, or no, the Port of, San Pedro, I think was. Anyway, and it was basically about containers, and that you couldn't stack containers higher than a certain limit because of aesthetics. There was an aesthetic regulation. And when I said, this is causing problems at the port, and we need, you waive this so you can stack the containers higher and clog up. Oh my God, you evil libertarian, that you don't care about the poor people. I mean, it's the Port of LA. That's why they live there. It's, and so, it's an issue. But I want to also say that there's another thing that I wrote about that I think is a great example of kind of structural racism in housing, which is at the other end of the market from the one that we tend to talk about, which is that, after the 2008 crash, there was legislation passed to, more control the market for mortgages. And one of the things that was passed at that time was regulations on what you could charge, how a mortgage lender could charge. And one thing they couldn't do is have a fixed cost and then a percentage. It had to be just a percent. Well, the problem is if you have a very small, believe it or not, there are in this country very cheap houses that cost $100 and something thousand, and they are disproportionately in not poor, but traditional middle-class black neighborhoods in places like Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And as a result of this seemingly very wise decision to keep mortgage lenders from gouging, those houses cannot be sold because nobody can get a mortgage. And the amount of wealth lost, familial, generational wealth lost, I mean, it's tremendous. And the reason that I say it's structural racism is there was nobody in the room when they were discussing that who ever heard of a mortgage for so little, in 2008, 2009, because they were all, highly educated and probably mostly white. But anyway, so I didn't answer your question.
So I'll make a point on this, and then sadly we're going to be out of time here, but I'll take moderator's prerogative here at the end, which is I think this is the really hard question. And I think it's all well and good to talk about the problems that bureaucracies create, the problems that too many non-representative inputs for voice can create, the way the status quo doesn't have to go through an environmental review. And none of that tells you what to do when you have actually gotten to the other side of one of those processes. And now the idea is we're going to build the pipeline through the poor communities because, and Virginia's right on this, but it's a problem, not just like it sucks to be poor is not a good answer to that, in my view. And so I think this is where, in the long run, and this is why supply-side progressivism for me actually requires that final word, right? Because I don't just want to increase supply. And progressivism has built into it a lot of views about equity, about small d democracy, about voice, about how to rebalance power in society on non-simply economic grounds that, on the one hand, I don't think a lot of those are working out as well as we hope they would. And on the other hand, I don't think we can just throw them overboard. That's why I find that there's a lot to be said for Bhaskar's view about associational democracy, that maybe what you want to be is trying to generate some of these interests up at a higher, more macro level so that we can make more positive sum trades in them, so that more views can be heard, so that representation is likely to be actually representative. But to me, in this project, this is like the truly hard problem. I don't think it's hard exactly to say we should have been importing baby formula during the crisis. I agree, like that is bad. Government does a lot of stupid things. It also does really good things, but knowing there's a balance there I think is always important. But there are a lot of questions here that are just genuinely hard to answer, and I think most of them revolve around the ways in which we have tried to create opportunities for political voice as a way of balancing out economic power. And a lot of those processes don't work well. But that doesn't mean the problem you're trying to solve through them